welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 6. The First Turkish Emperor. Last time, we spent the whole episode in the Western Khanate, covering its re-establishment after the collapse of Tardu up through the reign of Tong Yabgu Khan, and the Western Khanate's alliance with the Romans in their murder-suicide pact with the Persians. We left the West on the verge of invading Iran and toppling the tottering Sassanid dynasty before internal division brought the Western Khanate down. But today, we're moving to the east, because it is here, with the rise of the Tang dynasty, that the ultimate ruin of both East and West would begin. So for this episode, we need to rewind a bit. When we last discussed the Eastern Khanate, it was being conquered by Tardu. Tardu had ridden east to defeat the Sui and capture their puppet, Yami Khan. But then, the Sui had conspired with the tribes and with Tardu's own Ashna cousins to foment a rebellion that brought Tardu down. The Sui had been intimately involved in the rebellion against Tardu, having encouraged it as Tardu campaigned against China. So when Tardu fell, the Sui saw a chance to restore their puppet and restore their influence on the steppe. Yami Khan, their vassal, their puppet Khan, was a great asset to the Sui. At the same time, because Yami Khan was a puppet Khan of the Sui, he was never going to be the man who could unite the whole Khanate. There was just no way that the Westerners would ever accept a Khan who was a vassal to rule over them. This, as much as anything else, was a key reason why the Göktürk Khanate ultimately came to be permanently divided between East and West. Because Yami Khan owed his loyalty and his position to the Sui, they were able to use him, not only to pacify the steppe, but also as a weapon against their other enemies. The Sui effectively turned the Turks into hitmen, using their steppe power, their military expertise, to achieve Chinese military objectives. In 605, for example, the Sui deployed 20,000 Turks from the Eastern Khanate to crush the Khitans, the Mongol people who lived north of China and east of the Eastern Khanate. The Sui also threatened the Koreans with the Turks, warning them that if they did not submit, they would face an invasion from the steppe barbarians. But the Sui also provided the Eastern Khanate with opportunities. They organized border markets, gave the Khan and the nobility gifts of luxury goods, and engaged in exchanges of ambassadors, dignitaries, and hostages. But the Sui also kept an eye to the future and began to expand the border wall defenses, the vaunted Great Wall of China, which had been torn down or neglected during the prior centuries of steppe ascendancy. It was a good idea for the Sui to do that, by the way. Even though Yami Khan would remain a basically loyal vassal to the Sui up until the end of his life, even under his rule, the Eastern Khanate was not a perfect subject. The Turks seem to have sent ambassadors secretly to the Koreans and to the Khitan to see if they could get a better deal in an anti-Sui alliance, though nothing ever really came of this. And when the Sui ordered the Eastern Turks to assist in a planned invasion of the borderlands of the Western Khanate, the Eastern Turks demurred, and no such invasion occurred. But the situation from the Sui's perspective devolved further after Yami Khan's death in 609, while he was on a state visit to the Chinese capital. Yami Khan had been an essentially loyal vassal to the Sui ever since he fled to them following his defeat at Tardu's hands, perhaps even longer than that. As we discussed back in episode 4, Yami Khan had been in thick with the Sui when Tulan Khan had taken over from Ishbara. But his sons, who succeeded him, Shibi Khan and then his brother Chulo Khan, were far less into this Chinese alliance. I think Shibi Khan probably chafed at his father's subservience to the Chinese. We don't know how old Shibi Khan was when he succeeded his father, but he likely would have remembered the golden age of the Khanate in his youth, when Taspad ruled the steppe from the Pacific to the Black Sea. At minimum, he would have heard the stories. And now, here they were, vassals to the Chinese. How the mighty had fallen. And so, Shibi Khan, began to extricate himself from the Chinese alliance. Ultimately, this extrication would not only lead to the Eastern Khanate regaining its full independence, but would even lead to the very fall of the Sui Dynasty itself. Back in 604, Emperor Wen had died. He had been a man of truly great abilities, a relentless workaholic, totally dedicated to the task of reuniting China and freeing it from the Turkish yoke. But he was also paranoid and suspicious, and he had totally failed at preparing his son to succeed him. The Book of Sui gives the following summary of his qualities. Emperor Wen was by nature cautious and solemn, and he always made sure that his orders are carried out, whether it be an order for an affirmative act or for a prohibition. He got up early in the morning to host imperial gatherings, and he would not appear tired even after noon. Although he was himself stingy, but he did not hold back his awards when rewarding them to people with accomplishments. However, he was suspicious, critical, and picky, believing many alienating words of his officials. Therefore, even of those with the most accomplishments and of his old friends, not one was able to maintain the relationship from start to end. He even treated his own sons as enemies. These were his faults. Emperor Wen was succeeded by his son Yang Guang, who took the regnal name of Emperor Yang. Emperor Yang lacked his father's masterful touch. I think like a lot of people who struggle to fill their predecessor's shoes, especially when the predecessor is your own dad, Emperor Yang was both touchy about his status and prickly and aggressive, overcompensating for his mediocrity and his sense of inferiority. For example, there is this absolutely fantastic incident that occurred when Emperor Yang received a letter from the Emperor of Japan in 608. The letter said, "From the Son of Heaven where the sun rises, to the Son of Heaven where the sun sets, may good health be with you." I mean, it seems pretty innocuous, right? But Emperor Yang was infuriated that the ruler of Japan, a land that he saw as basically a barbarian island, would call himself a son of heaven, which is the traditional title of the Chinese emperors. It was insulting to him that this barbarian would put himself up at the same level as him. And then he interpreted the bit about the rising sun versus the setting sun as some sort of subtle slight or insult, an implication that these barbarians thought they weren't just his equal, which was insulting enough, but even somehow his superior. And then he made it even worse, because instead of just letting this go, his lack of self-confidence and his inferiority complex caused him to fly into a blind rage. He broke off relations with Japan and even began to prepare for war. He could only be persuaded with great difficulty that trying to invade Japan over a letter he didn't like was absolutely insane. The Chinese sources also say that as his reign progressed, the emperor's lifestyle became increasingly wasteful, hedonistic, and arrogant. He has a reputation as one of the worst and most tyrannical emperors in Chinese history. Now, this might be a bit of historical revisionism, as the Chinese scholars really needed to find a reason why he's about to lose the mandate of heaven, but it really doesn't seem off the mark. He was really bad at his job. But Emperor Yang's bugbear was not really the far-off Japanese archipelago, or even the Turkish Khanate, but Korea. Throughout the late 600s and early 610s, Emperor Yang was constantly engaged in wars with Korea, often trying to bring in the Turks as muscle. Eventually, against the wishes of his advisors and officials, Emperor Yang organized a massive invasion of Korea. He sent emissaries to the Turks, demanding that they join him, and then marched his armies out to the Korean peninsula. Having just succeeded his father Yami Khan, Shibi Khan was not interested in being the Sui's hired muscle anymore. He ignored the summons, leaving Emperor Yang ordering an insufficiently strong army into enemy territory, fighting a war that his chief generals and advisors thought was a bad idea. The Koreans responded by running a guerrilla war of resistance, ambushing Sui brigades, cutting supply lines. Obviously, morale among the Sui troops plummeted. Troops started deserting en masse. Emperor Yang reacted exactly like you would expect an out-of-touch, thin-skinned tyrant to act. He started ordering deserters to be brutally tortured to death. This led to mutinies and further desertions, as you would also expect. Meanwhile, back at home in China, as the news from Korea got worse and worse, peasants across China began to rise up in rebellion. At first slowly, but then quickly, the authority of the Sui began falling away. The dynasty began to collapse. Sui Khan and the Turks did nothing to save the Sui, despite increasingly desperate pleas from the Sui emissaries. Sui Khan was happy to collect the tribute benefits from the Sui up until about 615, when the Eastern Turks turned on the Sui. They attacked Emperor Yang while he was vacationing near the northern border in Shanxi province, placing the emperor under siege in September. According to the Book of Tang, the emperor was reduced to tears, clutching his son, trembling at the Turkish siege. Ultimately, Sui Khan lifted the siege. According to some sources, he was deceived in this by a Chinese princess telling him that relief forces were on the way. But it's also possible that his goal was just to spook the emperor and assert his independence, not actually to, decapitate the Chinese state. Emperor Yang would cling to power for 3 more years as his empire slowly collapsed around him. Peasant revolts and military mutinies broke out across China, all while, according to the Chinese sources, the emperor slipped further into debauchery, becoming increasingly delusional. He was eventually finished off in a coup by certain military officers in 618. Allegedly, his murderer said to him, "All of the earth is angry at you. It does not stop with just one man." For their part, the Eastern Turks were happy to sit back and watch this all happen. As the Sui collapsed, the Turkish Khanate became, once again, the premier power in East Asia. Sui Khan, in besieging the emperor, had also restored the prestige of the Khanate, no doubt enabling him to consolidate and expand his power on the steppe. Once again, the Turks were the masters of East Asia. The Sui looks set to be a mere interlude of Chinese hegemony in an era of otherwise Turkish rule. So everything's going to be great from here on, right? Even though they had regained their hegemonic status, their top spot in the East, the Turks had no interest in actually ruling China. In the aftermath of the Sui collapse, China descended into a period of chaos as former Sui officials and generals vied for power with each other and with rebel peasant leaders and with the leaders of noble families. The Turks, as the now top-flight military power, probably could have swept in and defeated these groups. But in spite of this overwhelming power, they just didn't do it. As a steppe empire, I think the Turks were just not ready or willing to rule such a large sedentary population, for now. Instead, they were content to follow the classic steppe model with relation to settled peoples. Extract what you can through trading and raiding, more of the latter when the settled peoples are weak. That said, various of the competing factions would send emissaries to the Turkish court, and the Turks would support various factions in vying for power in China. They shifted their support periodically in a strategy of divide and rule, trying to make sure that whoever was on top at the moment, no one could solidify control over China. But of course, ultimately, China would be reunited. And it would be unified this time in a far more permanent way. It turns out that the Sui were not merely an interlude, they were instead merely the precursors to the second great Chinese dynasty after the Han, the mighty Tang dynasty. However, as opposed to the Sui, who were Han Chinese through and through, the Tang would come from the north, from the cooked barbarians, the Sinicized steppe nomads who had founded the northern dynasties who were at home on the steppe and in China. We have discussed the process before by which the barbarians became increasingly cooked, increasingly Sinicized, after they established their little mini-states in northern China following the collapse of the Jin dynasty. Now, after the Sui swept north and accomplished their reconquista of northern China, these cooked barbarians stayed in place. They were still there. And as we discussed before, the culture of these people was a blend of Chinese culture and steppe culture, a melange. I like to make the analogy to modern-day immigrant communities. They exist in both the culture of their ancestors and the culture of their home, while at the same time creating a new culture unique to them. Think of how Turks living in Germany today are in some ways at home in both Germany and Turkey, but at the same time a little bit apart from both cultures. How Italian immigrants to New York City created their own Italian-American culture, distinct from the culture of the land of their ancestors, but also distinct from the broader American culture they live in day to day. And one of these noble families, descended from the steppe tribes who had settled in northern China, was named Li. Like a lot of these noble families with roots in the steppe, the Li family were a military family, high-ranking generals in the Sui armies. And crucially for our story, the Li family happened to be of Turkish origin. As the Sui Dynasty collapsed and the anarchy in China increased, the head of the Li family, a man named Li Yuan, struck out on his own. Li Yuan was a frontier military commander in the north who had stayed loyal to the Sui through all of their problems, until he revolted in 617. Though by this point, it's hard to say that this was really a revolt. I mean, who exactly would you revolt against when the central government has effectively stopped existing? It's important to note that he was from the periphery, the borderland between China and the steppe. And just like this borderland, he himself was a mix of steppe and China. He was intimately familiar with the cultures of both sides, and that meant political systems, language, social culture, military culture, and so on. You know, the French philosopher Michel Foucault had a thesis called Foucault's boomerang, that imperial societies develop modes of repression on their periphery that then come back to the center. And I think that this is something like that. The culture of the military frontier being imported back into central China. A similar thing happened in the Roman Empire, of course. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was basically the frontier culture, a mix of Germanic and Roman cultures coming home to the center. But here, unlike in Rome, instead of leading to an unraveling of the state, this ultimately led to a renaissance. Li Yuan would come to conquer China from the periphery, and it was essentially made possible by the Turkish Khanate. While Shibi Khan had no desire to rule China itself, he ultimately did back the Turkish Chinese man who would. Li Yuan, after his revolt, worked hard to cultivate Shibi Khan. He promised the Khan that he would allow the Turks to keep whatever loot they captured in raids of China, and wrote to the Khan that he would restore the tributary system that had greatly enriched the Turkish Khanate in the past. Shibi Khan was convinced and sent thousands of horses and hundreds of soldiers to assist Li Yuan. Now, the fact that Li Yuan was actually able to effectively use these gifts of men and horses shows actually how influenced by steppe culture he was. Li Yuan's forces used a combination of steppe tactics and traditional Chinese tactics in conquering China, including the famous steppe feigned retreat. Li Yuan was also well acquainted with fratricidal Turkish politics. In 626, he had his brother killed based on a fear that he would revolt, and he also killed off other members of his own family. Confucian culture saw this as abominable, but on the steppe it was kind of routine. But perhaps more interestingly, Li Yuan was culturally very Turkish. He drank water mixed with yogurt, that is ayran, instead of tea. He loved Turkish music and surrounded himself with Turkish retainers. In formal rituals, in Chinese political culture, or when he communicated with other Chinese potentates or the Chinese bureaucracy, he used Chinese, of course. But privately, his court spoke Turkish. Li Yuan would even say to his advisors how much he wished he could just ride off to the steppe, or he could ride around as a free man. And that's a very Turkish sentiment at this time. The role of women in his court was also far more Turkish. Instead of the cloistered life of women in Han China, women of the northern periphery were involved in the social life of the court, and they even lobbied the court, conducted business, and engaged in legal proceedings. Han Chinese nobles and Confucian bureaucrats were scandalized by these women and their presence in the court, not just the way the Turkish men socialized with them, but the way these women would interject and speak their minds in debates of state, which to them was just horrific. Li Yuan went so far as to build a yurt in the courtyard of the Chinese palace he lived in, complete with wolf banners, reminiscent of the wolves that led the Turks out of the valley of Ergenekon. In many ways, I think the yurt in the Chinese courtyard is the best analogy for him. On the outside, a magnificent Chinese palace, but in the inner courtyard, a Turkish yurt, Chinese to the outside world, Turkish inside. He was really the first Turkish emperor in history, even if he was not the emperor of a Turkish empire. I'm not going to go through the twists and turns, but by 622, Li Yuan had conquered and reunited China. In doing so, he relied heavily on the Turkish Khanate. Eventually, his control over China was secure enough that he, a Turkish general from the northern borders, was able to declare himself emperor. He assumed the regnal name Tang Kaotsu, inaugurating the Tang Dynasty. At the beginning, the Tang were very deferential to the Eastern Turkish Khanate. I think this was both in recognition of the crucial aid that the Turks had given, but also the greater prestige of the Ashina clan as the leaders of the more ancient Khanate. The Book of Tang says, "When Kaotsu had mounted the throne, the presents Shibi Khan received from first to last were innumerable. Shibi Khan, presuming on his services, grew more and more insolent, and was always sending envoys to Chang'an, most of whom were very overbearing. Kaotsu always behaved with utmost tolerance, as China was scarcely settled down. When Shibi Khan died in 619, Emperor Kaotsu declared a period of mourning throughout China and sent 30,000 pieces of silk north as a funeral gift. However, this would prove to be the height of friendly relations between the Tang and the Eastern Göktürk. Shibi Khan was succeeded by his brother Chulo Khan. Now, Chulo had been a Shad, serving under his brother, governing the eastern territories of the Khanate, most likely in today's Manchuria. But he lasted on the throne a mere 18 months before dying of natural causes. At his death, yet again, the inability of the Turks to develop clear rules of succession sowed the seeds of division, which yet again would ultimately result in catastrophe. We don't have details of the Kurultai, but the two claimants were Chulo's son Shibobi and Chulo's brother Duobi, which made Duobi also the brother of the late Shibi Khan. The elder Duobi was able to outmaneuver his nephew and become Khan. But Shibobi was not gotten rid of. He was appointed as a sub-Khan under his uncle, which of course created a point of tension within the Khanate. The ascendancy of Duobi marked the beginning of a far more aggressive Turkish Khanate. The Eastern Khanate began launching raids into China that became increasingly frequent and increasingly larger. There was some indication in the Chinese sources that this escalation of Turkish raiding began in the last years of Shibi Khan's reign, but there is no doubt that Duobi took it to the next level. Now, it's hard to know exactly why this happened. I think in part it was a dawning recognition within the Khanate that instead of helping a friendly kinsman dominate a part of northern China, they had inadvertently brought into existence a powerful and dangerous rival. Maybe they hadn't realized just how competent Emperor Kaotsu was, and how quickly he and his dynasty would succeed in unifying China. No doubt they appreciated the power that he had acquired, in part based on his sort of dual nature. He was a lord of the steppe and a lord of the Chinese court, and now he had succeeded in unifying and conquering all of China. But more importantly, Duobi also felt that he had to secure himself on the throne by providing plunder to the Turks and to gain recognition from the Tang. Victory in war and raiding, as always, remained key to legitimacy on the steppe. See, despite its military might and its hegemony over the Tang, despite the messengers of the Khan being overbearing and insolent in the words of the Chinese sources, Duobi knew that the Turkish state was not as strong as it appeared. As always, the inability of the Turks to develop clear rules of succession was a point of weakness. And the Turkish Khanate remained a steppe empire, that is, a nomadic state, confederal in nature and bound together by the strength of the Khan. Duobi believed that it was crucial to strengthen the central administration of the Khanate in order for it to survive a Chinese resurgence and for him to hold on to power. Duobi believed that to strengthen the state he needed to build stronger state institutions and find a way to solve the problems caused by the Turks' messy succession system. And like so many centralizing reformers throughout history, like Louis XIV or Peter the Great, he tried to alter the nature of the Turkish state by strengthening the civil administration under his control and weakening and sidelining the nobility, to cut out of power the Ashina nobility who could oppose him or rise up to overthrow him. In order to do this, he needed legitimacy on the steppe, which meant being successful in raiding and pillaging China. And this was a major reason that he escalated the Turkish raiding into China. Now, Duobi was successful in limiting the power of the nobility. He was able to successfully keep all other members of the Ashina clan at the Shad level or lower. He did not appoint new subkhans who could challenge him, with one exception, of course. He was unable to keep his rival, his nephew Shibobi, from becoming a subkhan. Perhaps Shibobi had been given this title by the Kurultai and could not be demoted. The strength of Shibobi's claim meant he could not be completely cut out of power, and he was made a subkhan with authority over the Mongol tribes in the east of the Khanate. But aside from this exception, Duobi was able to keep most of his Ashina relatives out of high state office, leaving them without access to the state's resources and its armies. Given the succession rules of the Turks, where any member of the Ashina clan could succeed to the throne, Duobi hoped that this would make revolts by the Ashina leaders harder to pull off. As the other part of his centralization program, Duobi brought in even more Sogdian and Chinese officials and advisors to staff an expanded civil service. These foreigners, these civil officials and bureaucrats, would allow this larger central administration to take over those aspects of government that were before done by the Turkish nobility. It would also allow for the central government of the Khanate to expand its power at the expense of the tribes. To fund all of this, and to entrench his own power, Duobi took this expanded central administration and embarked on a new program, introducing a regular, systematized tax system, a first in Turkish history. Though the Khanate had previously sent out tax collectors called tuduns to the subject peoples and tribes, there wasn't really a standardized system of taxation in place. Each tribe or subject people had likely negotiated what they were going to pay with some Khan at some point in the past, and each of these arrangements was bespoke and constantly being negotiated and renegotiated as conditions changed, with everyone having their own little exceptions and sweetheart deals in place, of course. Duobi wanted to get rid of this patchwork system of bespoke tax arrangements and create a standardized and organized system of taxation based on Chinese models, one where tax revenue would both be more regular and much higher. These reforms, of course, went hand in hand. By limiting the power and rank of his relatives, Duobi was attempting to sideline them and short-circuit the problems caused by the messy succession rules of the Turks, to stop the Ashina clan rivalries from ripping the Khanate apart. So instead of relying on his nobles, he relied on talented foreigners, people who could not revolt, who had no source of power other than him. And he used this talented foreign bureaucracy to rein in the tribes beneath him and to expand the power of his central state, which crucially involved systematizing and increasing taxes. Now, as part of this centralization program, Duobi likely wanted to come to a deal with the Tang. Raiding and making war on China did more than just cement his authority with the tribes in and of itself. Maybe after kicking their teeth in a bit, the Tang would agree to a favorable treaty, allowing for trade, recognition, and tribute to the Khan. This would really help him hold on to power. He would be the liaison with the Chinese state, and he would gain both legitimacy and treasure. He could use it to further strengthen his central administration. But here's the funny thing about Duobi. In his quest to entrench his power and create a centralized state, he ultimately sowed the seeds of his own destruction and the destruction of his state. The sidelined Ashina clan members, chief among them Shibobi, were unhappy with being sidelined. The tribes were unhappy with the new taxes and the foreigners running the state. But perhaps most importantly, Duobi's China policy ultimately backfired and ruined him. With the goal of legitimizing his rule, strengthening his state, and getting a favorable treaty with the Chinese, Duobi massively expanded the raiding into China, and this would come to produce a response in China. Now, under his reign, Turkish raiding of China became essentially constant. This was a time of increasing tension and warfare across the porous northern border. Innumerable raids, large and small by the Turks, increasingly going further and further into China. Chinese forces marching out onto the steppe to try to stop them. But despite the Tang dynasty's Turkish roots, their attempts to impose themselves on the steppe were not successful, for now. In 622, for example, Chinese forces launched a massive invasion following reports of famine on the steppe. The Chinese army was completely destroyed, and the Turks raided even further into China. But like I said, this environment of constant violence and raiding had an effect within China. Unlike prior dynasties, constant Turkish raiding and warfare forced the Tang to keep large imperial armies in the field even after unifying China. Typically, Chinese emperors were worried that a large standing army could potentially overthrow them, as had happened to several of the northern dynasties. They ended up being overthrown by their cooked barbarian generals. But the Tang had to maintain a large military to defend against the Turks. And even though this army started off losing to the Turks, they became increasingly familiar with Turkish tactics and increasingly experienced. Additionally, a large portion of the Tang army was drawn from the same sort of people as the imperial family itself. Descendants of Turks and other steppe nomads would settle down and become cooked, especially the officers. The Tang dynasty used its frontier military mindset, its own immigrant-like culture, its unique ability to function both within China and the steppe to create steppe armies. But steppe armies in service of the Chinese state and backed by all of its wealth, power, and organizational abilities. So Duobi's strategy, despite being initially devastating to China, ultimately sowed the seeds of the Eastern Khanate's undoing. In his effort to create a more powerful state on the steppe, Duobi ended up creating circumstances in which this new steppe-derived dynasty in China had to maintain large armies deeply familiar with steppe ways. In his effort to sideline his relatives to short-circuit the problems of the messy Turkish succession system, he created resentful elites within the Khanate who the Tang could use. In other words, the very actions that Duobi took to strengthen his state actually brought into existence the undertakers of his state. But it didn't seem that way at the start. At first, Duobi and the Turkish Khanate were very successful. After crushing the Tang invasion of the steppe in 622, Duobi led a massive invasion of China, marching as far as Chang'an, the Tang capital. The army came to the very walls of Chang'an itself. The Chinese troops panicked in the face of the steppe warriors, and the road to the capital was open to the Khan. The remaining Chinese forces in the region were led by Li Shimin, the future Emperor Taizong. For ease, I'm just going to call him Taizong. Now, I probably could have introduced Taizong earlier, but he's been by the side of his father, Emperor Gaozu, as he conquered and united China. Like his father, he was of Turkish origin, of course, a cooked barbarian, in some ways at home both in China and on the steppe. He was deeply involved in the twists and turns in which Gaozu had come to power, including the killing of his own relatives. In time, Taizong would become emperor himself, of course. But for now, picture him in his camp, with nothing but a couple hundred soldiers, staring at thousands of burning campfires lighting up the surrounding fields and hills in the night, proof of the massive Turkish host in front of him. Taizong acted with the sort of cunning that he was famous for. He knew he could not defeat the Turks in battle, so he rode out with a handful of troops and challenged the Khan to single combat. Now he knew Duobi would of course refuse this, so he also sent a challenge to Shibobi, making the Khan suspicious of his rival. Shibobi refused his offer, of course, but regardless, Taizong then began advancing towards Shibobi's part of the Turkish lines very slowly. This freaked out the ever-suspicious Duobi that Taizong must have made a deal with Shibobi. He therefore sent a messenger to intercept him immediately with an offer to negotiate. Taizong agreed, but sent messengers to both men, driving a wedge between them. Duobi and Shibobi now deeply distrusted and feared each other's intentions. In a battle, would one or the other switch sides to aid the Tang in destroying their rival? The Chinese sources say, uncle and nephew being thus at loggerheads, Duobi was unable to fight, even if he wished it. Yet again, the internal division of the Turks proved to be their undoing, this time exploited by the cunning Taizong, who used his own knowledge of the Turks and his familiarity with Turkish culture to defeat them. Taizong probably saved Chang'an and the fledgling Tang dynasty, but the only deal he was able to negotiate with the Turks involved a massive tribute payment to the Eastern Khanate. And even this small victory for the Tang proved short-lived. In 626, a mere 2 years later, the forces of Duobi again invaded China. This time, Duobi came with an even larger horde. By this point, Emperor Gaozu was maybe even more afraid of his son Taizong than he was of the Turks. So instead of sending Taizong against the Turks, which would have necessitated putting him at the head of an army, which was very, very scary to Gaozu, he announced that he would instead put the army under the control of another one of his sons, Li Yuanji. But Li Yuanji did not have Taizong's reputation as a great general, and Taizong was able to use the fear of the Turks to stage a coup and overthrow his father in the famous Xuanwu Gate incident, forcing Emperor Gaozu into retirement. Taizong then declared himself emperor. 19 days later, the Turkish armies appeared before the walls of Chang'an. Again, Taizong really did not have a lot of cards in his hand. He was newly established on the throne, and was therefore on unshaky ground politically. His father still lived, and was watching and waiting to retake the throne. And while he had more troops at his disposal this time, he and his generals still knew that they could not defeat the Turks in open battle on the field. But at the same time, they knew the Turks were not masters of siege warfare. Yet again, Taizong opted for a bold move. A political move, not a military move. The Book of Tang relates, he galloped out of the Xuanwu Gate and proceeded to the river Wei, speaking with the Khan across the water, and moreover reproaching him with forsaking his agreement. The group of Turkish chiefs, seeing the emperor, were startled and all got off their horses to salute. Suddenly, the bulk of the Chinese army came up with a brave show of flags and cuirasses, and with quiet but imposing ranks. The bandits were in consternation. The emperor and the Khan dropped their bridles, motioning to the troops to draw further back. One of the emperor's nobles, kneeling before his horse, remonstrated with him at this despising of the enemy. The emperor said, "I have thought this well out. It is not the sort of thing for you to understand. Now the Turks, in sweeping their territory of men for a raid on us, think that because we have newly had internal troubles, we cannot muster an army. If I were to close the city, they would loot our territory wholesale. Hence I go out alone, to show that there is nothing to fear, and I make a show of force, to make them know I mean fighting. To their surprise, I have been able to thwart the original plan, and they, having now advanced a good way into our territory, are afraid they won't be able to get back. Hence, if we fight them, we win. If it is peace, things are strengthened. It is by this move that we get the whip hand of the enemy. And this gambit worked. Duobi and Taizong negotiated a peace treaty, and they sealed it with a traditional Turkish horse sacrifice and by becoming blood brothers. Remember, Taizong, like his father, was a Sinicized Turk, a cooked barbarian. He spoke Turkish and was deeply familiar with the culture of the steppe. Taizong knew the strengths and the weaknesses of Turkish power, and he really demonstrated that and used it in both of these instances with the Turkish armies. He knew the importance of personal leadership in Turkish political life, how the ties that bound the Turks to the Khan worked, how the internal politics of the Turkish Khanate could be used against it. He even knew the little stuff, like how to do a horse sacrifice. He didn't dare send Chinese troops out onto the steppe to be slaughtered by nomadic horsemen. He didn't ride out from Chang'an to fight the Turks on the field. Instead, he used his cunning and his knowledge of the Turkish Khanate's political structures to score diplomatic victories, even when military victory was not possible. From Duobi's perspective, though, he had done it. The whole purpose of his invasion of China was not to conquer Chang'an. It was not to destroy the Tang. It was to be recognized as a powerful Khan by the emperor to strengthen his own legitimacy. Check. Secure a treaty providing him and his central state with tribute revenue. Check. Open up a trade relationship that would ultimately benefit the central state of the Turkish Khanate. Check. Successfully raid the rich settled world to provide plunder to his followers. Check. After getting his treaty with Taizong before the walls of Chang'an, Duobi returned home to the steppe. His great moment of victory would last a year. Taizong, for his part, bided his time. He ultimately believed, rightly, that the Turkish Khanate could only be brought down from the inside. In 627, a massive revolt of the subject tribes broke out, quietly supported by Taizong in the beginning, and eventually openly supported. The roots of this discontent lay in Duobi's innovative new tax system, which was deeply resented by the steppe tribes. When a famine swept the steppe, the new onerous tax system prompted mass revolts. The Chinese sources say that the year 627 was unusually cold, a year of unseasonable cold, according to the Book of Tang. In this year, the tribes lost innumerable flocks to the cold. Remember that steppe tribes did not move their herds into barns in the winter. Yet Duobi kept the new, higher, and deeply resented taxes the same, and so the tribes rebelled. The principal rebels were, of course, the Tiele. These guys have basically been revolting for a century or so at this point, and the Khitan. The Tang, for their part, actively supported them. At first, Duobi sent Shibobi to deal with the Khitan rebellion, but instead of crushing it, it seems that Shibobi joined the rebels. Shibobi had been nursing his resentment against his uncle ever since he lost the fight for the throne, and there was clearly a great deal of tension between them. Likely, he didn't try that hard at putting the revolt down, and he instead began negotiating with the Khitan as soon as he could. The Book of Tang says that upon learning of Shibobi's failure to crush the Khitan, Duobi ordered him imprisoned and flogged. Shibobi thereupon fled to the Tang. Regardless of exactly how far along the road to revolt he was when he first departed to fight the Khitan, when Emperor Taizong offered him the chance to flee to Tang safety, Shibobi didn't think twice. He promptly joined the rebellion. Taizong and Shibobi then also reached out to the other Ashina nobles, who hated Duobi for cutting them out of power. These nobles also jumped at the chance to get rid of Duobi, and they were quickly drawn into the revolt. Taizong, the Ashina rebels, Shibobi all used the popular discontent among the tribes with Duobi centralizing reforms, the high taxes, the foreigners at his court, framing all of this as trampling on steppe tradition. This is a theme that comes up among steppe rebels all the time, that claim that the new order, brought in by the centralizing, tax-hiking, foreigner-loving reformer, is anathema to the steppe life. It's basically the same argument that Bumin likely made against Anagui Khan a century earlier, when the Turkish Khanate was brought into existence. And so the revolt spread, helped along by the elites of the Ashina clan like Shibobi and by Emperor Taizong. The Turkish state, yet again, descended into chaos. After failing to crush the Khitan, Duobi sent his son Yukuk Shad to defeat the Tiele rebellion with 10,000 horsemen. Unfortunately, faced with mass defections, Yukuk Shad was defeated by the rebels in Gansu province in 627. But this is not the last we will hear of Yukuk Shad. As the Khanate in the east began to collapse, he would flee west, where he would live to fight the Tang again, as we will discuss next time. Further defeats for the Turks followed the defeat of Yukuk Shad, and the Tang support for the rebels grew. Defections among the Ashina clan continued. Some Turkish tribes also fled west, into the Western Khanate, then under the rule of Tong Yabgu Khan at the height of his power. It was around this time that the Tang sent messengers to Tong Yabgu Khan laden with gifts, begging that he not intervene to assist Duobi. And it was here that Duobi's incessant raids and attacks on the Tang finally bore their bitter fruit. As the Turkish Khanate weakened, both losing troops on the battlefield and losing them to mutiny and rebellion, those large Tang imperial armies became the supreme military power in the region. Large Tang armies marched out onto the steppe, and with the Turks divided and weak, they conquered. In the summer of 628, a large number of Khitan tribes surrendered to the Tang. In reality, this was really the rebels putting themselves under Tang direction, as the Tang began to openly prosecute a war against the Turkish Khanate. The Tiele rebels also accepted Tang suzerainty in exchange for recognition. By that autumn, in 628, the Eastern Turkish Khanate entered its death throes. It began to collapse. High-ranking members of the Ashina clan continued to defect to the Tang. This was accompanied by rewards and tribute to the defectors. I think Emperor Taizong's own Turkish roots, his own comfort with Turkish customs, his legitimacy on the steppe made this possible. Taizong, as a Sinicized Turk, a cooked Turk, was able to work with these Turkish elites on their own terms, speaking their own language. In many ways, the Eastern Turkish Khanate wasn't so much conquered by a Chinese emperor as it was acquired by another Turkish Khan. Almost like an M&A deal, where one company comes in and buys out another company to run and operate and to expand its operations. But we shouldn't imagine this as like a peaceful boardroom transaction. The proximate reason that the Ashina clan and the leaders of the Eastern Khanate began to defect was the success of the rebels and the Tang on the battlefield. Yeah, they were very upset with Duobi before. They didn't like being sidelined, they didn't like the tax system, they didn't like the foreigners, but it took defeats on the battlefield to convince them to turn on the Khan. In the winter of 628, Duobi retreated to the eastern foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, trying to remove himself from the collapsing frontier with China and regroup. The Turkish state continued to face internal revolts. These revolts were funded by the Tang, and Duobi was unable to put them down. Defections accelerated, with more and more Turks either submitting to the Tang or fleeing west to Tong Yabgu Khan. His position weakening by the day, Duobi had no choice but to move back to Hohhot in Inner Mongolia to attempt to regain control of the situation, but to no avail. In the summer of 629, Tang forces managed to retake Shuofang in Shanxi province, the gateway to the steppe. As Duobi continued to weaken, and as defections strengthened the Tang, the Emperor Taizong made his decision. Next year, his troops would march out and crush the Turkish Khanate once and for all. And so, in spring 630, as the snow thawed, the Tang launched a full-scale invasion of the steppe. Emperor Taizong sent out 6 armies under the command of Li Jing, apparently no relation to the imperial family, but also of northern Turkish extraction. In the north, the Chinese attacked westwards from Manchuria. In the center, the Tang troops crossed the Lo Zishan Mountains west of the Chinese heartlands towards Inner Mongolia. In the south, Tang troops marched north from the recently liberated Shufang and Luoliang in Shanxi province. As the northern army marched west, the central and southern forces converged on Dingjiang near the Yin mountain range. After a bloody battle, the Tang forces were successful. Dingjiang fell, and along with Shufang, the Tang now controlled all of the major passes from China onto the steppe. Duobi now had no choice. He had to retreat to the Yin mountains. Then came more bad news. In the north, the Tang forces and their rebel allies crushed the Turks. At the same time, as the Turkish troops faced defeat at the hands of these new powerful Tang armies, the Tang were able to infiltrate Duobi's court and induce the defection of remaining key nobles. Duobi fled to the mountains near the Yellow River, northwest of the city of Luoliang. Miserable, he hid out in a cave with a few remaining supporters and his small band of remaining troops. Duobi now had no choice. The game was up. The state had been destroyed. He was hiding out in the mountains like a fugitive. He decided to open up negotiations with Emperor Taizong to negotiate a surrender and submission. However, Emperor Taizong's negotiator, that commander Li Jing, had been given commands to take the Khan with him to the emperor. Interpreting this broadly, Li Jing launched a final assault against Duobi's forces and captured the Khan. Duobi's wife, a Sui princess who had spent over 30 years living on the steppe with the Turks, died in the attack. Broken, Duobi was brought before Emperor Taizong on March 29, 629, in Chang'an, where he made ritual obeisance. After listing the so-called crimes of the Turks, Emperor Taizong ritually forgave him. The Eastern Turkish Khanate was no more. Duobi was allowed to retire with a Tang pension to an estate in Henan province, where he would spend the rest of his life hunting deer and succumbing to depression. Eventually, he took his own life in 634. Thus passed the last Khan of the Eastern Göktürk. Duobi and Emperors Gaozu and Taizong were in many ways foils of each other. One was a steppe ruler who wanted to make his state more sedentary, more Chinese. The other two were Chinese rulers who brought steppe military prowess and modes of government into China. In some ways, they were both trying to make sort of a fusion state, but starting from different ends of the spectrum. And ultimately, it was Emperor Taizong who succeeded, and whose fusion state would go on to become a truly Eurasian superpower. Duobi's story is like a classic Greek tragedy. He was brought down by his own victories and by his own plans, whose unforeseen consequences destroyed him. Building a centralized state required large and reliable tax income and using foreign expertise, which ultimately led to resentment and rebellion. Invading China to force the Tang to recognize him in order to gain the required legitimacy and revenue for his state-building project ultimately resulted in the formation of large, permanent Tang armies that destroyed his state. Strengthening the civil administration and sidelining the other members of the Ashina clan in order to stop fratricidal power struggles ultimately led to their rebellion and the ruin of the state he sought to strengthen. He began his reign as the acknowledged supreme power in East Asia. He ended it in a mountain valley, his wife dead, and himself in chains. After Duobi's capture, the remaining Turkish forces on the steppe surrendered and recognized the supremacy of the Tang. The question for the Tang then became what to do with them, these remnants of the formerly great Eastern Göktürk. Some of the Tang advisors wanted to ship them into China itself and force them to take up farming. I think the thought was to break the steppe threat by getting rid of the most terrifying steppe riders. However, Emperor Taizong realized what a waste this would be. He decided to harness the strength of the Turks, use their military prowess, to merge them into his powerful new steppe armies, to use his own Turkish roots, his ability to speak to the Turks on their own terms, to integrate the Turks into his new state, to in essence become a Khan emperor. So instead of shipping off the Turks into China, or putting them under the rule of their steppe enemies, he incorporated the Turks into the Tang Empire. He divided the Turks into small tribes, who he settled into what is now the Ordos region of Mongolia. He then set up 500 leaders from the Turkish elite, including many members of the Ashina clan who had defected to him, to rule over these new small Turkish tribes, giving them both Turkish titles and formal Chinese titles and ranks in the Tang court. Like Taizong himself, they would come to exist in both worlds, in both the Chinese court and on the steppe. The Turks thus became assimilated into the Tang state, and the Turkish tribal structure became integrated into the Tang Empire. For 50 years, they would come to serve as the backbone of a now all-powerful Tang military machine. A military machine built from largely steppe-style Turkish armies assembled by the Turkish origin Li family, but backed by the vast wealth and power of the Chinese state. This new military machine would come to expand Chinese power far beyond anything accomplished by past dynasties. And next time, we will discuss the expansion of this new power to the west, where the tottering Western Khanate has fallen into chaos after the assassination of Tong Yabgu Khan, and we will finally bring to a close the story of the first Turkish Khanate.